So, Henry, maybe we could just start by you talking a little bit about the photo of you on the front cover of Homelands, and then I'll talk a little bit about the photo of me because I love seeing these two photos side by side. We're so different, and yet at the same time, I can see these little echoes between us.
Good morning, Chitra. I'm holding Homelands in my hands, which arrived this morning, a wonderful book. And on the cover are these two photographs of friendship, the history of a friendship, but two quite different people. I'm looking at myself. I must have been about, what, 6, 7 years old. Strangely enough, I've got Tiroler hosen on, a sort of Bavarian costume. Even being a Jewish boy in Nuremberg, that it was quite common. It's like wearing a kilt in Scotland. So there was nothing unusual. In spite of Nuremberg being the horrible Hitler town, the town where all these rallies were held, this was quite a normal thing to wear, and I lived happily with my parents as an only child.
So, what year would this have been, Henry, if we think, you
This
were
would
6 or 7?
be 30.
Yes, I was going to say
Around
late
about 30,
20s or
yes.
1930.
Yes.
And so, where was this photo taken? Are you standing
This
on the
was
steps
taken
of your
the steps
flat?
of our veranda. It was a lovely veranda, and down into the yard and into the garden.
And what was life like then? Paint a little picture of, the little boy in this photo. What kind of life was he
Life
living?
as an only child, life was quite normal until 1933, till Hitler arrived. And then, of course, it changed. 1935, the Nuremberg laws were published. You became a non-citizen, you became an outsider, you became something else. You were persecuted. It was horrendous. And particularly living in Nuremberg, we lived in the Fürtherstraße, number 15 Fürtherstraße, this huge wide road between Nuremberg and Fürth, where they were marching 15 abreast with bands playing in Hakenkreuz, flying brown shirts, black shirts. It was horrendous. It went on day in, day out, week in, week out. And anti-Semitism was rife, particularly in Nuremberg. The local Gauleiter was Streicher, who published these horrendous newspaper, Der Stürmer, the Stormer, on every street in a glass case, these horrendous caricatures of Jews. Life was tough.
I remember you once telling me through the research for this book. We've done so many interviews over the years, Henry, you and I, haven't we? And I do remember you once telling me that when you came out of the front door at 15 Furterstrasse, where you lived with your mum and dad, that there was the glass case right outside
Yes,
selling
right
the
outside.
Sturm.
It didn't leave here. It's just too horrendous. I mean, anti-Semitism in Nuremberg was so bad. Our synagogue was burnt a year and a half before any of the others by the order of Streicher. So life was very tough. And of course you kept yourself to yourself. You didn't meet with other people anymore.
It's so amazing, isn't it, to see all of that history swirling around this cheerful little boy with his arms crossed. You look like such a little character. I love this photo of you. And it's actually a close-up. The original photo, you're flanked by your mum on one side and your
That's
dad
correct,
on the
that's
other. And the three of you together, you look so dapper and elegant and yeah, like a lovely sort of metropolitan trio of Nurembergers,
It looks a happy picture. And then, of course, here is that little Indian girl.
Yes. And when I look at this photo of me, so this is us kind of, jumping forward some decades to 1980s Southwest London. And this has always been quite a big photo in my family because I found another photo of a birthday party of mine, which must have been around the year that this was taken. So I think I'm a bit younger than you are in your photo. I'm maybe 4 or 5. So it's a kind of just started school age. And this photo is framed on a table with the most horrendous 1980s princess cake, absolutely covered in fondant icing. You can imagine it. Very 80s. And there's this photo sitting there at the party. So it must have been considered to be, this is a great photo of Chitra.
Absolutely.
This is a very important photo.
Absolutely.
And I think what I love about seeing the two of them together is obviously we look so different. We are growing up in completely different cultures. We have different backgrounds. We are different sexes. We're different races, our ethnicities are different, and yet there's something in, I don't know, the stance that our bodies have. We look kind of the same.
I mean, this is the first time, just came this morning, it's brand new.
I know, it's so exciting.
And the first to hold it in my hand. I wonder what people will make. They look at this book, Homelands, and they look at these two photographs. What have these two together? When not realizing, all right, 2 children, but we were then decades apart.
I know.
That's when we first met.
I know.
When we first met, you came to interview me.
That's right.
This was the most amazing interview. You phoned, could you come? And I said, no, I don't really want to. We are busy talking in air that day, Ingrid and I, we both. But I decided you were so persuasive that, okay, come. And you came of an evening.
That's right.
With 2 other people.
That's right. And you and Ingrid had been to talk to a group of teachers in Air.
That's right.
And I remember so clearly walking into this flat. And of course, by this stage, I'd been a journalist for a number of years. I think, so this was June of 2011. So about, just over a decade ago now. And I had never interviewed anyone like you and Ingrid, despite having done so many interviews by that point.
Well, may I say, I have never been interviewed by anybody like you before.
Oh.
This is it's quite amazing. I've had lots of interviews, obviously, with Holocaust Memorial Day, etc. But you were different. You asked different questions. You were kind. You were. I said to Ingrid, this is different. I'm sure when you went away, I invited you for dinner to come back.
You did.
There was an immediate response. And then a few days later, when I saw this 2-page article in the Scotsman, I realized this is a person I would like to get to know better, obviously. There was an immediate connection.
There really was.
There really was. I mean, yes, it was just different. I must say, that article, it's the way you wrote about it, the way you wrote about us and about yourself, and the whole thing. From this one article, I knew this would be somebody to be friendly with. And then, well, we had dozens of interviews later. And eventually what happened? We got Homelands in the end. Unbelievable that this would happen.
I know. Well, it's been an incredible decades journey. And I think what's happened for me in that period of time, and it really did take the writing of this book to kind of make this discovery, is at the start of the book, I felt that the interesting thing about us was our differences. And that's what made this story so interesting, was how different we are, everything that we've already discussed. But by the end of the book, I had gone on this amazing journey, and I suddenly realized how similar we are and all of the commonalities. And that ended up being such a major theme of Homelands, was, the common ground between us and the kind of the shared outlook, if you like, and the shared perspective.
Definitely the common ground and the shared outlook, as you say. But the difference in age, it just made no difference. It came to nothing. It became a friendship, an honest, fantastic friendship The age didn't matter. We had
Absolutely.
the same sort of ideas, and it went extremely well. About writing a book, I wasn't sure. You would like to write a book about yourself and us and your parents, and how could that do? But it did do. We all of a sudden, I'm an incomer, you're a second generation incomer, Windrush, etc. These things all came to play, and it became, it evolved into more than a friendship. It's just, we know each other, we feel for each other, your family, your children. I mean, the whole thing became a lovely story.
Absolutely. It's been one of the most important friendships of my adult life, both personally and creatively as well. And I think one of the really big catalysts for writing this book was also a massive event for you in your life, was the moment when you got your files. You applied through your MP, you were interested in finding out more about your past. You had certain hunches, certain feelings, but they had never been corroborated. And so maybe we can turn to that now, that eventually you got sent your files by the National Archives and made some incredible discoveries.
As I was interned as a dangerous enemy alien through writing to my uncle, corresponding with the enemy, and I became incarcerated in the Isle of Man eventually for 10 months. Many years later, I said to myself, did they really suspect me? Because at the age of 16, I became a dangerous enemy alien because of writing to my parents through my uncle in Belgium. I said, did they really believe that? Because I knew, somehow I knew. I got a new guy in the camp, and he was half British, half German.
The Fort William metallurgist.
Absolutely.
I love this character. He does seem like a character out of a spy thriller.
Wonderful. So years later, I said to myself, well, I knew this guy was from MI5. How can I find out? I wrote to my MP, and he said, well, why don't you write to the National Archives? And lo and behold, it's all there.
That's right.
You're not to get it for the next 25 years, but we did manage to get it.
And it was this extraordinary, 50-odd page file.
I know.
Retelling you this history of your own life. What a thing to see. And am I right? I think you received that in 2018, which, as you said, was when the Windrush scandal was breaking as well. And it seemed so pertinent. And the discoveries in there, for me, were a key entry point into writing Homelands. And that story of your first 23 months in Britain, in which you were interned in 6 camps across the country, was the most astonishing story, one of the most astonishing stories I've ever been told as a journalist.
Yes, but the strange thing about the 23 months, when I came here, I was received by Mrs. Harwich. I was given a room. I was treated like a son.
And she was your guarantor,
She was my guarantor. Not only was she my guarantor, she herself came from Latvia in the late 1890s.
She was an immigrant, a Jewish immigrant.
So she gives this to another immigrant. But apart from that, I was well treated. There was no I went to school, and I was evacuated to Perthshire. And to me, the excitement of it all, we were on a farm. First of all, we were on a farm. There was potato hawking for school holidays. There were horses, there were cattle, there were sheep. This was all new to me. And I went to school in Balhousie Boys' School. I was well looked after by the headmaster. I was the only foreign boy there. So the whole thing was an excitement, new ideas. And then we were Frog and Denny, a sort of boarding school type place, run by the Glasgow Council. We had hound dogs. We had dogs, and we had a gamekeeper. And this is new to me. And he took me fishing in the river.
That's right, the city boy from Nuremberg.
I know,
it must have been astonishing.
So this was excitement. But this excitement stopped when I was sent to the High Court in Edinburgh. And then it changed into into horror in the camps. So at first it was exciting. New holidays with the Sassoons in Kakubri. First time I saw the sea. So it changed immediately when I was interned.
And what they suspected was that you were corresponding with the enemy.
Correct.
They misconstrued these letters that were kind of moving between Brussels, Paris, and your mum in Nuremberg, and assumed that somehow you were being used and you were corresponding
When
with the
I was
enemy.
arrested, I was taken to the High Court in Edinburgh. My lawyer wasn't allowed in. So I was 16 years of age. I stand at the High Court in Edinburgh. I remember it well. The name of the judge was Sir John Strachan. He wasn't a sir then. I remember it well, with two other people. I was accused of corresponding with the enemy, which was strange to me. I wrote letters to my mother. They knew more about me than I thought. They knew I had an uncle in Paris and an uncle in Brussels. So you see, they keep tabs on incomers. And of course, within half an hour from friendly enemy alien due to religious persecution, I became a dangerous enemy alien category A. They didn't know what to do with me. I mean, 16, good God. Two policemen took me to Waverley Station, put me in a train, locked me in a train. Two policemen collected me at Queen Street Station in Glasgow, took me home to Mrs. Harwich. I was given an hour to pack a little case, allowed one phone call, and then I was taken away to the police station. But when we got to the police station, the sergeant said, "Oh, can't take him? He's under 17, and you can't get in a cell." A real Glaswegian policeman. So they didn't know what to do with me. They sent me overnight to some hostel for criminal boys. And eventually I ended up in Edinburgh and eventually in the Isle of Man.
It was the most astonishing story. And I do remember after that very first meeting in June 2011, going back and trying to squash this incredible story into 1,500 words of journalistic copy and going, there is a book in this, there's an entire book just in this 23 months. And of course, finally, 10 years later, I got to write my chapter about those 9 months of internment. And it's actually one of the most challenging things I've ever had to write in my 20-year career.
In
And
spite of the horror.
it's a very little known story with lots of contemporary echoes, tragically. I don't think people know that Jewish refugees were interned during the Second World War. I just don't think that that's common
Well, I
knowledge at
know.
all.
Look, apart from Wharf Mills, which was a terrible camp, we were abused, it was a horrendous story. The other camps were fairly reasonable. We had enough to eat. We could do things. It became, for me as a kid, I was 16, remember, all these people, the place was full of professors and teachers and doctors, without their wives interned. Their wives were here somewhere in Britain. It became a university to me. The men, to get through the day, they played chess with their back to the table, given 10 seconds to call out the next move.
I love
So it
that
was an
story.
education to me that we were allowed to cook, we were allowed to bake. We had, obviously, I learned a lot from everybody. There were lectures on any subject of medicine or philosophy that you could imagine. It was, I mean, most of these people were very well educated, German and Austrian and Czech Jews, lots of who became famous people, became publishers, became scientists, won the Nobel Peace Prize. It was tremendous for a young boy. And when I was released, I was sent back home. Funnily enough, after being in 10 for 10 months, all of a sudden you're released. Why was I released? I was released because I was under the age of an internment. I should have never been interned. I was under 18. Okay. So the commander gives me a ticket. On you go home. all of a sudden, after being 10 months amongst your friends, amongst people you get to know, all of a sudden you're alone, which I found the journey home to Glasgow frightening.
Mm-hmm.
Still got a bit of a German accent. I still have, obviously, 90 years later. Where am I going to ask from the boat in Liverpool which train goes to Glasgow? It was all new to me. It was the journey. I was glad to get to Glasgow in one piece. It was quite frightening. After being 10 months in a crowd of people whom you knew, all of a sudden you're left out into the open and you have to face life as it is.
I love that story, and I remember writing about that in Homelands and how beautifully and touchingly it expresses how young you were, really, that actually the internment itself was less traumatic than the journey home because you were so unaccustomed to your own freedom. That suddenly having the complete freedom to go where you wanted was overwhelming for you because you were just a boy.
Yes, I was just a boy, yes.
And you mentioned, Henry, there cooking in the in Camp Peveril on the Isle of Man, and this brings me to another shared love of ours, which is food and cooking, and why you ended up, you know, cooking wherever you went. You seemed to find your way to the kitchen somehow. And why was this? Because I'd like to talk a little bit about Baden-Baden and how you ended up going to this German spa town and
Why was
working in
this-
a Jewish
Why
kosher
was this
hotel.
cooking? My mother came from Heilbronn, and her family in Heilbronn, her brother, they had a restaurant, a big restaurant, they had a brewery. And when I went on holidays to Heilbronn, I usually spent half my time not only with my cousins, also in the kitchen. So even as a boy, this was normal for me, to be in a kitchen amongst chefs. And eventually when we were chucked out of school in Nuremberg, we were not allowed to be in school anymore. We were chucked out. Fortunately, in Fürth we had this Jewish grammar school, Israelitische Realschule Fürth, where we got very good education there. There were 52 people in my class, unfortunately, because that's where we could go, but we had a good education there. But my mother decided, with foresight, she was a remarkable woman. She said, we have to learn something. You have to earn a living somewhere. She took me out of school, which I really hated. I loved school.
And what year was this?
That was in 1937. 1937, correct. She took me, I was sent to Baden-Baden, to the Hotel Tannhäuser, a very well-known kosher Jewish hotel in Baden-Baden, where I learned a lot in the 6 months that I was there. We had only one chef, Johannes Schneider. He was very kind to me. He taught me things. I was usually in the pastry department beating the dough for cakes, the Schnee, as we call it. And I learned a lot in these 6 months. It gave me, you know, I mean, you're young and you're in that, we worked 6 days a week, half a day off. But I learned a lot. So much so that when I left there, I left fortunately just before Kristallnacht. I wanted to go home to see my parents.
And you, obviously, you were living in the present and you had no idea what was coming. And yet you made this very, very serendipitous decision to suddenly end the apprenticeship and go back to Nuremberg and see your parents.
That was
And can you tell me, what date that was? Because you'll never forget that day.
It was on the 8th of November. I decided I've had enough. I would like to go home and see my parents. I've been for 6 months completely working there. I was told you can't do that. You've got an apprenticeship. You can't do that. My parents had to pay for me to be an apprentice. But I decided to go home. My mother must have sent me money for a ticket. And I simply went home, just as well, because in Baden-Baden.
And this was the day before the
The day before,
Reichspogrom.
I arrived in Nuremberg on the 8th. On the 9th of November, Kristallnacht, the pogrom against German Jews. Thousands of synagogues were set alight. In Baden-Baden, the synagogue was certainly set alight. Fortunately, nobody died. They were all arrested and taken to Dachau. I escaped that. I went to Nuremberg. At home, it was horrendous the next few days. What happened? People were beaten up. Because my father wasn't Jewish, they didn't come to our house, but they went to our friend's house next door. People were beaten up. Glass in the houses were smashed. The downies were stripped open. Everything was full of feathers. It was absolutely horrendous. And then we knew we can't stay here.
And shortly after that, your mother, who became such a massive figure for me in the writing of this book, I absolutely fell in love with your mother, in fact. And I ended up, working with a close friend of the family, Kit, who helped me translate all these wonderful letters that she wrote in the ruins of Nuremberg, because she did survive the war, almost all of it in Nuremberg itself, except for a short period in hiding at the end. And she wrote these amazing letters. But she was the one, Henry, wasn't she, really, who managed to secure you this place on the Kindertransport?
Absolutely. How did this come about? She had a cousin who had come to Glasgow, and she phoned her and said, "Can you help me? Can you find somebody to take my boy in?" And she found, this cousin found Mrs. Gammers, this cousin called Grete Gummersheimer. She found Mrs. Harwich, and that saved my life. That absolutely saved my life. But the episode in Baden-Baden sort of made me sure that I can, having been away from home, it gave me some background, and I knew I could cook. It came about when we were arrested. The first place I was sent to after Maryhill Barracks, where I was for 2 months with German prisoners. I was sent to Edinburgh, to what's called Donaldson School. It used to be Donaldson School, a deaf and dumb school. That became an internment camp. I was there. This was before the internment of refugees. I was a dangerous enemy alien. I was there with 25 German soldiers, German seamen, yes? And they called me a dirty Jew or whatever. What could I do? I was sent to Edinburgh. And we were no sooner there. The commander of that camp said, "Is there anyone here who can cook?" When I think of it, I put my, yes, I said, I can cook. I was sure I could cook.
It's just the most pure distillation of
it's just-
Henry,
it's
this story, isn't it?
And I did cook. I mean, when I think, I was in charge of 25 German sailors. One of them called me a dirty Jew, somebody else knocked him out. Then we got a British corporal in the kitchen, and we had to prepare a meal. And this is when Churchill in cabinet said, "Intern the lot, collar the lot," and all German Jewish refugees, Austrians and Czechs, were interned. Mm-hmm. And who came to the camp in Edinburgh? Mm-hmm. My cousin Jeff Warren, and my future father-in-law Usher Wolf. I didn't know about him; he didn't know about me. So here we were. We were a few weeks, and then we moved on to other camps.
Mm-hmm. And could you speak just a little bit, Henry, about the Kindertransport journey itself? Because it's been so interesting since I've written this book. Obviously so many people will say to me, what's the book about? And I'll say it's about my friend, Henry Wuga. He's a German Jewish refugee, and he came on the Kindertransport. Well, you'll be surprised how many people don't know what the Kindertransport is.
Kindertransport was a wonderful rescue operation. British Jews collected money, went to the government and said, could we at least save the children? And they asked in Germany, could they at least save the children? The Germans were quite glad to get rid of us. They agreed to that, and Kindertransport started. So from December 1938, beginning of December, the first trains left. Trains every week came to Britain. 9,500 children were saved. So what can I tell you? My mother told me, you're going by Kindertransport to Glasgow. Well, where's Glasgow? I had no idea. Somewhere in the north, I found out later. I thought it was Bristol, Glasgow. Okay. I was looking forward to that. But being a bit of a feisty boy, I had a cousin in Paris. And I said to my mother, okay, I go to Glasgow, but why can't I go to Paris for a week and then take another train? But it wasn't like that. We were taken to the station. The train arrived. You say goodbye to your parents, not knowing whether you would ever see them again. It was quite traumatic. I had been in Baden-Baden. I had been out working. I could cope with it. In this train, there were over 100 children, some 5, 6, and 7 years, who had never been away from their mum and dad before. They were not crying, they were howling, they had no idea what was going on. It was horrendous. I mean, it was a dreadful journey. I can't tell you how many hours it was to the Dutch frontier, 5, 6 hours. When we crossed the Dutch frontier, things happened. The German guards left the train, and in Holland there were ladies there with hot chocolate and apples and sandwiches. You were treated like a human being. And even the young children who had no idea why they're on the train or where they're going, even they stopped howling. They realized that somebody's giving you something, somebody's making you welcome. And the thing lifted from your shoulders. It was really quite amazing. Quite amazing. From there we went to from Holland.
The power of kindness, really, in that moment, isn't it? And it's almost like your memory. I remember writing this section of Homelands and feeling like the first part of that journey, that terrible, traumatic train journey to the Dutch frontier, it's almost in black and white. It's so bleak, it's so dark, it's the howling of the children. And then suddenly your memory comes back in Technicolor, and it's red apples, and it's white bread. And
white bread.
Yeah,
the
details.
White bread, I know. I remember that.
And it's all about
from there to Liverpool Station. I read in the paper only the day before yesterday, you know, with this crisis in the Ukraine with the refugees. So Britain took in 9,000 Jewish children. But why only 9,000 Jewish children? Why not their parents? Yeah. Their parents weren't allowed to come. Only unaccompanied children were allowed to come. Anyway, we came here and it saved our life. So in Liverpool Station, we were collected by whoever guaranteed for us. Many had no guarantors. They were then sent to, they were looked after in a camp. But it was a bit touch and go. People came to pick up children. People came to, so there were brothers and sisters, but people would only take one. To take a child in 1938 here in Britain, you had to look after the child, educate the child, dress the child. You had to give £50 to the government in case the child has to go back. So it was quite a problem. But many of us found guarantors, and many of us went to school, and many of us stayed here, and many of us did very well in this country.
And almost all of you stayed, actually.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So many wonderful stories, Henry, and it's just been such a privilege for me to be able to write them down and to, you know, to be able to have access to your amazing archive, the National Archives file, but also all your photos and documents. I mean, you really are a man who's kept everything, aren't you?
Well, that's what I do. I know I have kept everything. It's amazing.
It's wonderful.
The amount of stuff I have, letters to my mother, I really have kept everything. But all the story you're asking me to tell about, you have written this book, you have condensed that, and you mixed it with your upbringing, with your family, with you being also, your parents being an immigrant, and you distill this beautifully in a wonderful book. And I hope people will understand what is written in it, and I hope they will like your book.
Me
It is
too,
wonderful.
Henry. And what does it feel like to,
It's,
after 10 years
it's
of,
wonderful to have that
I've
in
been
your hand. I
interviewing
mean,
you for
wow.
such a long time,
I
haven't
know.
I? We've
I
done,
know.
I don't know how many hours of interviews, but my transcripts of interviews with you run way beyond 50,000, 60,000 words. They're almost the same length as this book. And it's been such a privilege for me as a journalist to keep going over these wonderful stories and to focus. We did one interview, returning to Baden-Baden, that was about just one photograph. We spoke for a whole hour about a single photograph. I mean, that was
Well,
thrilling
it's
for me.
it's the way you deal with things. You look at a photograph, I would say, differently from other people. You see more in the photograph. Why is his hand holding this pot? Why is he not smiling? Why is there something in the background? You go into it, you analyze it, and you write about it, and it's most interesting to me. It
Well,
makes the story.
absolutely. And because I'm not a historian, it was quite a job for me to kind of position you in history and to really know, all the detail of, the day that you sent that Red Cross letter was the day after Churchill gave his "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech. And, just these very tiny details really helped me to sort of locate you in history and move you around in your life. And that was a big decision for me in particular, to not make the book chronological, but to have 100 years of history, because that's what this book spans, from your birth in 1920s Nuremberg to the present moment. It had to make all this history happen at the same time. I knew that I didn't want to start, in a kind of conventional Henry was born in and end with the present moment. It all had to be happening at the same time.
If I may say, I think this makes the book not being chronological. You dip in and out. Even 50 pages later, you go back to something you had observed. And it makes the story readable and understandable and believable, not just a chronological set out of dates.
And it's how we remember, isn't it? I wanted it to almost evoke the way in which memory functions. We don't think chronologically. One moment, well, you can speak to this more than anyone. You're 98 years old now. And I do wonder what it's like to look back on your life. Do you find yourself dwelling more now on your childhood than you maybe did
Well, I
20,
do
30
think
years
about
ago?
it. What I find all of a sudden the last few years, all of a sudden you're somewhat alone. People you knew have all passed away. Most of them passed away. It's quite unusual, yes. But that's how it is. I try to manage. My daughters look after me, and they keep me alive. Without them, I couldn't operate. So I appreciate this very much indeed. Fantastic.
And it
Thank you
feels
very much.
lovely to hear you say that's how it is, because that's such a Henry Wuga catchphrase. It's in the book a few times, but more than that, it's in my physical makeup now. Whatever's happening in my life, I always have a Henry Wuga voice in my head saying that's how it is, and it really helps me in moments of difficulty in my own life.
I find it's you have to face facts. Yes. You've got to. As you say, well, that's how it is. I try and cope as best I can. As you get older, it becomes more difficult, but I keep trying.